Hello and welcome to the podcast. This week we're examining claims that the broadcasters and the rest of the media are failing to correct untrue and sensationalist stories in the increasingly heated debate about immigration control, and in particular failing to give an accurate account of what the European Commission on Human Rights is and does. If you read some newspapers or follow certain broadcasters, you'd think human rights judges are constantly stopping deportations on the flimsiest of grounds, even, supposedly, because a child didn't like foreign chicken nuggets. But a major new report from the Bonavero Institute at Oxford University has found that much of this coverage is misleading, often sensationalized, and far removed from the facts. Out of 379 media items studied from January to June this year, the report says that the vast majority mischaracterized the law, the appeals system, and the ECHR itself. Well, to dig into what the report found, what it tells us about the media, and how public service broadcasters like the BBC measure up against tabloids and partisan outlets, I'm joined by one of the authors of the study, Dr. Alice Donald, Professor of Human Rights Law at Middlesex University. Dr. Alice Donald, welcome to the podcast. What led you and your colleagues to study how the ECHR is covered in the UK media? I mean, some people will think, you basically support it and you're looking to produce a report which says that actually all the criticism is misplaced. Did you start from a partisan position?
No. So the three of us that did the main work on the report are all academics, researchers. And what we had observed, just sort of anecdotally in a way, was an intensification of media reporting about the ECHR, specifically in the context of immigration. So negative reporting, in fact, is nothing new. This has really been, I think, a feature of the media landscape for probably 20 years or more. But we observed a sort of intensification and then set out to see if our hunch was correct. And so what we found over the 6-month period, the first half of this year, when monitoring for mentions of the ECHR in any context, we found that, in fact, 3/4 of references to the convention in the UK media were in the context of immigration, and specifically, in this period at least, in the context of stories about deportations of foreign national offenders.
But did you start from a point of view of thinking that the convention is a good thing and that it's been maligned and it was one of your jobs to prove that it had been maligned? Or did you genuinely set out to say, right, we'll look at the evidence and then we'll come to a conclusion?
Well, if I can fudge this, possibly both. I do, as a scholar, broadly think that the ECHR is a good thing in this country and indeed across Europe. Happy to discuss the reasons why. And we were also genuinely curious to sort of take the temperature in a way of media reporting in this country. And I think one of the spurs for it, which perhaps goes to your first point, are the increasing calls for the UK to consider withdrawing from the convention. Now, this would be a completely unprecedented step for a democracy in Europe. It has never happened. It is not even really a topic of mainstream political discussion in other European countries, which is also something that I'm seeking to research at the moment. So this would be what the UK already is, I think, in many ways, a complete outlier in the European context in terms of withdrawal from the convention having become the topic of mainstream political discussion, phone-ins, etc.
Although we have had, in recent weeks, two cabinet ministers, one Labour, former cabinet ministers, one Labour, one Conservative, Jack Straw and Sir Malcolm Rifkind, both arguing, I think for slightly different reasons, we should withdraw, suspend our membership. You've also had Charlie Faulkner, Lord Faulkner, defending. So it's coming very much here into debate. But an article based on your research for the Reuters Institute, which rather had a, shall we say, provocative headline. It's like drinking polluted water, how the UK media gets immigration wrong and how to fix it. Let's leave the how to fix it to a little later. But polluted water? Why was that phrase used?
I think possibly it's conveying a stronger criticism of the media reporting than we intended in the report, if you read the full context of the report. What that was specifically referring to as a metaphor was the tendency that we observed in this media monitoring. So this yielded about just under 380 individual reports for the first half of this year. The tendency for a relatively small number of particular stories in which news outlets had reported that foreign national offenders had successfully challenged deportation on what would appear to be very sort of trivial human rights grounds. So if I can give one example that's probably become the most well-known or infamous is to do with chicken nuggets, specifically that an Albanian foreign national offender who had a deportation order against him, as reported, successfully challenged that because his son, who had or has emotional behavioural difficulties, only liked British chicken nuggets. Now, even at the time that this was reported in January, February of this year, the decision that he should not be deported had already been overturned by the Upper Immigration Tribunal, which had also made clear expressly, and this is in a published decision, that the fact that his son liked British chicken nuggets had no bearing on the case, that it was nowhere near strong enough evidence to mean that the man shouldn't be deported. So A, it wasn't the basis, and B, the decision was overturned anyway. But it continued to be reported, and indeed to this day. Nigel Farage has referred to the chicken nuggets case, Kemi Badenoch has. So that was the specific context of perhaps an unfortunate metaphor in retrospect of drinking polluted water. In other words, the whole framing of the question of the convention has been sort of scaffolded around these few stories which at root are erroneous, that were misleadingly or incompletely reported.
And what you, I think, make clear in the report is that once a story gets into the hands of, well, shall we say the Daily Mail or Daily Telegraph or Nigel Farage or whatever, it's a very comprehensible story. We don't have to read anything complicated. We can get it. But it's picked up. But I think the suggestion of your report is that other, if you like, more, how can I put this, more considered, more respectable, more public service publications have a tendency to follow the story dictated, as it were, by the popular media. In other words, once the story is printed or is out anywhere, it does get picked up. That's a pretty stark criticism of something like the BBC, isn't it?
Yes, we weren't in any sense singling out the BBC here, but it has happened indeed that, well, let's take the chicken nugget story to continue that example, that was, for example, picked up in the New Statesman. It was referred to in passing in a story about the immigration debate, etc. And reference was made to the chicken nugget story as if indeed it was, would appear to be an unfortunate, very sort of trivial, misjudged decision by a judge, when it ever was. So the stories, what we've observed in the patterns of reporting were that stories, as stories do indeed, take on a life of their own and come to be, almost urban myths in a way. So you may remember about 15 years ago, Theresa May referred to a story about a man who resisted deportation because he had a pet cat. And this became sort of mythologized almost. Again, the fact that he had a cat was a tiny detail in the whole context of the life that was being described in that case. And I think what we observed is not just that, as you would expect, stories can take on a life of their own and just come to be repeated when their origins are no longer explored, but also a very particular ratcheting effect whereby a story might be reported, it might then be picked up by a commentator, a think tank, perhaps a politician, as the chicken nugget story was by both Nigel Farage and Kemi Badenoch. And their comments are then reported again by the original media sources. So it's not just that the story is repeated, but there's a particular kind of ratcheting effect whereby they achieve a real prominence in national debate and indeed are made a fairly significant basis for the, as I mentioned, absolutely unprecedented calls for the UK as a democracy to withdraw from the European Convention.
That's a pretty dire comment on some politicians and also on media, including some public service media. But I wonder whether or not also it's the limitations of news. I mean, let's consider for a moment you are editing a news bulletin with a large number of items and a lot of important things you want to get in, perhaps from foreign news. And then Kemi Badenoch makes this particular, or Nigel Farage, statement about the chicken nugget. The temptation will be to say, to report it, maybe report somebody who's rejected it, but report it and move on. What is not provided is context with somebody doing what you're doing now, which requires more time. So that's a fundamental problem with news. Do you report a politician when you think that they're telling an untruth or not? If you start not reporting them, you'll be accused of censorship. So I suppose you can say it's the responsibility then of the current affairs and other programs to put that in context. But what you seem to be suggesting is once this sort of hare gets running, it's extraordinarily difficult to stop it. And then, of course, it's yesterday's headlines. So it lodges in the memory, but people just move on. And then it's, as you say, referred to even by the New Statesman, shall we say, who would think on this issue have a different point of view, in a glancing reference, because presumably that author, writing against a deadline, hasn't actually gone back to and discovered what it's about. This is pretty depressing about journalism, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've just described perfectly what happens. And indeed, this is really why we wanted to write the report, because the report not only picks up on the different types of misreporting and the different instances of it, but also explains indeed how the immigration tribunal system works. And of course, there's no reason why a non-specialised reporter would necessarily know that. And indeed, it's not helped by the fact that the Home Office has not, over many years, has not gathered and published in an accessible way data about, for example, human rights-based appeals against deportation by foreign national offenders, which was the predominant theme in the reporting in this 6-month period. So the intention of the report, indeed, is not to bash the media, shall we say. I was a BBC journalist myself for nearly 15 years, so I understand all the pressures that you've just been talking about. But I think the very natural tendency, of course, to tell stories, which is what journalism is about in some ways, it's often what academia is about too. I think it is very natural, it's very much to be expected. Not every individual report can provide the full context or explain how, immigration tribunals and courts work, etc. However, the problem occurs when these individual stories, which may indeed be having been erroneously reported, also can give no sense of scale. So this is the other thing that we tried to do in the report, is even with the rather messy and incomplete data that's available, to say, well, okay, how many foreign national offenders have in fact successfully challenged deportation on human rights grounds, usually the right to family life or the prohibition of torture. And we found that less than 1%, so something like 0.7%, in the period for which we had data of foreign national offenders did in fact manage to resist deportation on human rights grounds. But I think the reporting, even if it didn't say so in terms, often implied that this was a much more common occurrence than it actually is.
Oh, it is, because if you take something like GB News, for example, I think probably their only coverage will be, I want to exaggerate, I mustn't exaggerate myself, but the majority of their coverage will be to take an example of this, because it strikes home, because it also plays to those people who at home who don't like what's happening in society and think there's real changes, and it delivers them what they want, and therefore they continue to listen. And as this fragmented universe we now have increasingly, we've got an absence of authority, haven't we, in terms of who do you go to, who you can trust. And the BBC was testifying, I think, in front of the House of Commons Committee about the need to, yes, it's got to reach, for example, GB News people. But the obvious question is, do you reach them by providing them the stories that they want, or to a degree that the stories also that they might not want, but they also need to have? But the media context is so much more difficult now, isn't it?
Yes, and indeed even more fragmented, I think, than your question implies, because one thing we didn't have the capacity to do in the report was to monitor social media, or to see, for example, how, because we were monitoring but essentially national news websites of the main newspapers, GB News, BBC, etc., ITV. and Channel 4. So that was our sort of the limit of what we had the capacity to monitor. What, of course, we then didn't see was how far the chicken nugget story, for example, has circulated on social media, on TikTok, etc. So I think what we were seeing, probably was very much the tip of the iceberg. But you're right, this very, very fragmented media universe in which any source is apparently as trustworthy as any other was very hard to monitor for a start, but it's also extremely hard to correct, shall we say, or to inject context.
Because it's yesterday's news, because yesterday's news were on to today's headlines. The report did actually make me feel sorry for judges. Because, of course, they get it in the neck, and sometimes doubts they deserve it. But a lot of times, as you say, the detail is taken out of context, and they're blamed for decisions they didn't actually take, or for reasons that they didn't actually have. Did you detect, or have you detected, I suppose you haven't been able to research it properly, that sense of frustration within the judiciary, that in this area it is getting increasingly difficult to make a considered judgment and have it responsibly reported?
Yes, we didn't engage with judges in the process of the research, but actually what's very interesting in the last few days while the report has been circulated is the response that we've had actually from those who currently or who previously worked within the immigration tribunal system. So indeed, not just a frustration, because of course it's very hard for them, impossible really, for them to make a riposte to some of these media.
Yeah, they can't get involved in a public fight, can they? They can't demand a right of reply from the Mail or the Telegraph or whatever, no.
No, that's right. They certainly can't. And it's even worse than that. I think we do allude in the report to published comments by the Lady Chief Justice about the physical threats to judges, or the threat that they feel of physical attack, not just in this particular context of immigration, but from it has now become a sort of commonplace, I think, of public or political discourse in this country to attack what are often called lefty lawyers, activist judges, etc. And I feel that I hear it anecdotally from colleagues and wider networks about the threat that they feel under, as do, for example, refugee charities, people who actually work directly with people seeking asylum. So these are not just, academic questions. They're ones that are having real life consequences for people working in these professions, as well as people seeking asylum themselves.
Now, I suppose I'm guilty a bit like others that I've just criticised, in the sense I'm talking to as if the convention is solely about immigration, or rather deportation. It's a lot more, obviously, and on the question of deportation, I think there's nothing, well, if you believe Charlie Faulkner, that stops one deporting someone as long as, if the criteria are fulfilled, except you can't deport them to a country where you do genuinely believe that their life will be under threat, or that they may be passed on from that country to another country where their life meant to be under threat. So, but moving aside from that, what are the aspects was it possible for you to analyse what parts of the European Convention on Human Rights are never mentioned and that should be mentioned in the debate?
Yes, great question. So what's ironic really about this whole issue is that in fact the convention influences or touches upon migration policy and decisions really only at the margins. So there's a sort of paradox to all the kind of heat which has been generated through this discussion in an area of life in which, in fact, the convention doesn't touch very heavily. The convention doesn't contain a right to asylum. It doesn't contain any right for somebody to live or reside in a country that's not their own, etc. So it is indeed, as you say, these rather exceptional cases of a person that might be deported or extradited to a place where they could face torture, or with a very high threshold, family life issues, which usually concerns children. Yes, but other areas of life, indeed. So the convention, of course, contains the right to free expression, the right to freedom of religion, the right to a fair trial, all sorts of other democratically, the rights that underpin our democracy, the right to free and fair elections. So there are whole areas of life, indeed, the rights of people with disabilities. The convention has had a very tangible effect in this country, for example, on the issue of inquests and investigations into deaths, either at the hands of or in the care of the state. So the Hillsborough inquest, for example, wouldn't have happened really without the Human Rights Act having enshrined the right to life in UK law. So there are many, many issues, many cases that are used also just in everyday life. You know, many of us may think, well, we live in a democracy. We're never going to need human rights law. We can go about our daily business. But, you know, there are numerous cases in courts and indeed just in day-to-day dealings with public authorities, or to protect the rights of people in care homes, for example, which don't make the media, to return to our theme of what's compelling to media coverage.
Well, do you have to decide, or you have say that you have made the statement, how we fix it? Well, you said, what's gone wrong and how we fix it. Well, turning to how we fix it, strikes me we're pretty powerless in this sense that we can't do anything much about social media. I mean, people will just communicate as they want their views, and that's in some ways a good thing, but I mean, it depends how well informed those views are. Then you have the politicians who, for clearly, and I think this applies particularly with the rise of reform, politicians who seem to be most reluctant to widen the debate on the European Convention. They're rather scared to do so, and I think that applies, is my personal view, particularly to the Tories under Kemi Bader, not given the threat from reform. So the extent to which news is often or reported depends largely on the stances taken by political leaders and so on. We're not going to get much help from there. Right, so talking to the media itself and the BBC, for example, which is a particular focus of this podcast, what can be done to correct this? First of all, partial view about what the convention is about, and then the frequent misreporting about that small aspect of it to which you've alluded to.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think indeed we have in this country reached a really perilous moment, actually. We have Reform UK has already, of course, announced that it would want to pull the UK out, not just of the European Convention on Human Rights, but also other human rights and treaties and the Refugee Convention. Again, totally unprecedented for any democracy to even contemplate doing that. And I fully expect Kemi Badenoch to announce at the Conservative conference that the Conservatives would seek to pull out of the ECHR. That seems to be the way it's heading from everything she said.
Just on that, though, I mean, you can... This is where I have difficulty. If you pull out of the convention for one reason, there are a whole raft of other reasons that you've just outlined why the convention exists and how it's built into British law, and we haven't mentioned Northern Ireland and etc. So you can't just pull out without having a plan to replace it and presumably to protect a whole raft of other things that are in there. So that presumably, if any journalists are listening to this, one of the first things they should do if Ms. Badenoch makes that announcement is not say it's wrong or anything, but ask the follow-up questions, which, well, what's in its place?
Well, great. Absolutely. I could suggest a few more follow-up questions for journalists. Yes, A, what would you replace it with? So presumably some kind of British Bill of Rights that wouldn't have, of course, the full protective mechanism that the European Convention offers, including, in the end, although very exceptionally, recourse to the European Court of Human Rights. But also, as you've mentioned, Northern Ireland, it would be a breach of the Good Friday Agreement to pull out of the ECHR. That would be, upended and need to be renegotiated. The ECHR is completely embedded within the Good Friday Agreement and was a very important part of it in terms of the lack of trust, of course, that existed in the British state. It would also cause the EU to terminate the part of the post-Brexit trade and cooperation agreement that relates to security cooperation. They have said explicitly that they would terminate that part of the agreement if the UK was to withdraw. The ECHR is also written into the other devolution settlements, so it would upset the devolution settlements also in Scotland and Wales. And there has been quite vocal opposition from the devolved assemblies to this proposition. And that's just for starters, so there are a whole raft of, I would say, unavoidable and highly negative consequences. In addition, of course, the loss of reputation, that Britain would be isolated on the world stage just at the moment when, in fact, international cooperation, trust often expressed through international treaties is exactly what we need in the context of the climate emergency, Russian aggression, trade wars, and indeed migration. This is perhaps the biggest irony, that actually pulling out of the convention I think unavoidably would make it much more difficult then to negotiate agreements which are exactly the kind of detailed on the ground measure that might in fact help politicians to get a grip on this question of illegal migration.
You've put a interesting quandary for journalists, particularly those in public service, BBC and so on, which is they have to take sides on whether the convention is a good, bad thing. But they have a responsibility to explain what it is, and then a responsibility to say, if we're going to discard it, what are we going to replace it with? And all that is legitimate without taking sides. But I can hear and feel a lot of people thinking, whoops, it's a hot matter of political debate, particularly if one of the major parties, or we should say now, two of the major parties are going in a particular direction and the third party, the present government, is relatively quiet about it. We're being political if we push. And I think you could see that with Brexit, which is whether it was right or wrong, Brexit right or wrong, there was a focus on pulling out, not a focus on if we pull out, what happens, what sort of society, what we do. So regardless of your view about Brexit or Europe Convention, there seems to you, I'm sure, and it seems to me, an absolute obligation on anybody involved in what they might think of as public service journalism to actually inform people about what the convention is actually about and the questions that need to be answered.
Yes,
do you have any,
right.
but are you optimistic about that? It should happen, will it?
Part of me feels like it just could never happen. As I said at the beginning, it's unprecedented for a democracy, for a mainstream centre-right party like the Conservatives to be even considering withdrawal. So there has been quite a lot of pushback in other European states also on the matter of immigration. I think it's very tempting for politicians everywhere faced with this very complex and intractable issue to sort of externalise it and say, if only we could just get rid of people, if only our hands weren't tied by this convention and by this, troublesome court, etc., that we could do what we liked and the problem would go away, etc. I don't think that's true. I think at a practical policy level, the issue of illegal migration is one that requires, a whole raft of detailed and difficult actions, some of which the government, I think, is now starting to take. But the whole debate about, if we pull out of the convention, the problem will be solved, is really just an attempt to kind of externalise it onto the European Court specifically, which, by the way, that we also mentioned this in the report, has ruled a handful of times in UK immigration cases. So 13 judgments since 1980 against the UK in a case involving the removal of a person from the UK.
And by the way, it's nothing to do with the European Union, and I believe that this country was instrumental in setting up the European Convention anyway, in the first place.
Yes, both of them.
Oh, well.
Both of those things are true also. So there's not much historical context to this discussion either. But it is such a dangerous moment. And I really think our work is not about bashing the media at all. It's really about asking for kind of political responsibility, of course, indeed, from our politicians, but also, exactly as you've said, this kind of scrutiny on the consequences of withdrawal and what the politicians who are proposing it would do to mitigate. There have also been a number of reports recently from right of centre think tanks that I seem to be attempting to kind of clear the ground here and to say, we could in fact pull out without it being a major problem for the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, when that simply isn't true. It's a legal nonsense and a political nonsense to suggest that the UK taking that step would not seriously damage trust and indeed just breach the agreement. So I think there's a lot of, I would say, misinformation and even disinformation, which is being purposefully pumped out at the moment about the ECHR and about the consequences or the supposed lack of consequences of withdrawal. But really, I've also separately from this report written with my colleague Joelle Grogan a number of explainers which precisely are aimed at journalists published by UK in a Changing Europe. We've just published one yesterday on this question of the impact on the Good Friday Agreement. So there are some, and indeed there are many others that other colleagues have written. There are many sources that journalists can turn to get certainly a sort of solid legal analysis of what the consequences of withdrawal would be.
Well, Dr. Alice Donald, thank you very much. And there's a challenge to journalists and people in the BBC at the moment to explain and give context as usual. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great to be on the podcast. Thank you.
Our thanks to Professor Alice Donald. Please do support us for less than the price of a cup of coffee per month. You can do this by signing up to patreon.com/BeebWatch for £1.99 per month, and you can find the link to this in the description of this programme. By becoming a subscriber, this will also entitle you to my weekly blog, which gives my take on the week's interview. You don't have to read it, but I'll try and make it interesting and informative. And that's all for this week. As you probably know, this podcast is presented by me, Roger Bolton, and it's produced by Kate Dixon. The sound is by Dave Kitto, and special thanks to Quingenti. It's a good egg production. Until next time, goodbye.